Hi everybody, Dana Litwin here again with more Tuesday tips for leaders of volunteers. And today I'm very excited to announce the launch of the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement. And in 2022, the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, a joint effort of funders and nonprofits, was commissioned and created as a first of its kind national research study on strategic volunteer engagement in the social sector. So funding partners for this include the Lady Foundation, the Lodestar Foundation, Volunteer Match, the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, where I do a lot of pro bono work, and the UJA Federation of New York, with some really helpful technical assistance by independent sector. So this is definitely a group, big team effort going into this research study and analyzing these findings. So there's two new reports that came out of this initiative. The new reports are the State of Volunteer Engagement, Insights from Nonprofit Leaders and Funders from the Do-Good Institute at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and that's kind of a quantitative study. And then there's a qualitative study, Investing in Strategic Volunteer Engagement, from Dr. Sue Carter-Kale. And you know Dr. Sue she's been on this channel before and Volunteer Commons, and her website and her consulting and her research is really well known and regarded worldwide. So a few key takeaways from the research include nonprofit CEOs are facing an increased demand for services. I don't have to tell you all as leaders of volunteers, your boots on the ground, you know this. But it's good to get this data to acknowledge the invaluable contribution of volunteers to their organizations. However, we all know we're having difficulties in finding enough volunteers to meet demand, sometimes even mission critical roles. Despite the critical role of volunteers in the nonprofit sector, organizations are often not seeking funding specifically for volunteer engagement. And funders, on the other hand, may be willing to provide such support if they understand the impact that volunteers have. The third big takeaway from this research is that volunteers play a crucial role in the success of nonprofits and should be recognized as an integral part of the workforce. Despite this, volunteer efforts are frequently overlooked and not fully acknowledged or resourced. So this is what we're trying to change with this very high level effort. So this is primarily, we researched and studied and surveyed and did focus groups with organizational leaders, CEOs, executive directors, and funders and philanthropists and foundations. So Dr. Sue Carter-Kale's research includes revealed that grant makers and funders noted the lack of capacity, organizational maturity, and infrastructure to engage volunteers as the main barrier to funding. At the same time, nonprofits emphasize the lack of adequate funds and time as barriers to building the capacity to engage volunteers. So we know as a sector, and again, being practitioners, that this has been like a terrible catch-22 self-fulfilling cycle for a long time. So this is why we created this initiative with the National Alliance and these other partners to figure out where is this disconnect happening. So more from Dr. Sue. Funders worry about volunteer effectiveness, feasibility, and sustainability when awarding grants and prefer giving to programs rather than operations. And a lack of agreement regarding strategic volunteer engagement, what it is, how one measures success, makes it difficult to show the ROI or return on investment clearly. Now, as nonprofits and government agencies, or really anyone who's utilizing volunteers for their mission impact, knows we continue to face an increase in demand, limited resources, and reduced staffing capacity in the wake of the pandemic. And new research finds that volunteer engagement has become more, not less, important to advance the work of any organization, but volunteers are now harder to find and engage. So highlights from the quantitative survey by the Do-Good Institute found that there's more demand than ever for nonprofit services, and volunteers are a vital part of that. So again, we're trying to solve, give executive leaders, organizational leaders, and funders the tools and the knowledge to fix this gap, fix this major miscommunication and understanding. So some highlights from the do-good side of the study, the survey, found that nearly 2/3, 64.4% of nonprofits reported an increase in demand for their organizational services, with a little over 51% increasing their delivery of services, and a little under 50%, 48.5% increasing staff workloads, you might have felt this yourself, to help meet demands. At the same time, 28.7% of nonprofits are operating with less funding and less paid staff than they had before the pandemic. Another interesting statistic that came out of the Do Good Institute's survey research is that nearly half, 46.8% of CEOs say that recruiting sufficient volunteers is a big problem for their organization, with many sharing that their volunteers were doing less of any specific organizational activity today, like delivering services or fundraising for advocacy. And 72.2% of nonprofit leaders felt that volunteers improve the quality of services or programs provided to a great extent, but only 25.2% of funders agree. So that's a pretty big disconnect between resourcing, funding specifically for volunteer engagement, defining it, and having an understanding at the top levels of executive decision makers of how crucial and important it is to have strategic volunteer engagement as a core strategy for mission impact. And so there's a lot of kind of talking about we love volunteers and things like that at organizational levels, but it's important to ask for specific funding and then use this and other research to back up, specific to your organization or activity or programs, use that data to back up that this is why we require grants and funding for volunteer engagement. Now, speaking to you all as leaders of volunteers, as practitioners, we also know from another new study by Volunteer Pro Toby Johnson for her annual survey of practitioners and salaries and types of work that we're doing leading volunteers, that a lot of us have multiple plates in the air. We wear multiple hats, we serve multiple roles, especially with the staffing shortage and the volunteer shortage. So while this research is aimed at changing the hearts and minds and convening conversations for executive leadership of organizations that utilize volunteers and funders, both those who are currently funding volunteer engagement specifically, and there are some models and examples in the study that I'll share in the website so you can download the full reports and read yourself in the video description. But having those conversations at that high level actually is useful for leaders of volunteers to understand the power and the impact of this research, and sometimes surprising or hard to hear hard truths, hard to hear, that there is a disconnect, and there can be, on the funder side, a distrust of effectiveness or lack of data or proof of effectiveness in many cases of volunteer impact. So what that means for us as practitioners, while these conversations are happening at higher strategic levels, if you're a director of volunteer services, hopefully you have a seat at that leadership table, or you pull up your own chair and plant yourself there. But knowledge is power. So if you understand and can educate others within your organization or the community in general, or any relationships you have with funders or organizational leaders, bring this to their attention. And this is part of a larger campaign to create awareness with the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, and there will be other action items and toolkits, and there's a lot of helpful resources already, not just this study, but other resources on the website. Again, I'll link to it below. But all of this ties together with, pretty much anything you want to do to advocate for your own profession, for your programs, for your team of volunteers. And it all ties into the common issue of just disconnected and assumptions and belief systems that if we just get funders and organizational leaders into these conversations, and specifically funding volunteer engagement and asking for funding of volunteer engagement. That will help move the needle on mission impact and help pay for professionals like yourselves, CVAs, people who are qualified to lead volunteer services in those roles. So I hope you enjoyed these Tuesday tips, kind of a good thinker today. And again, I'm just super excited to get this research and these results out into the world. So take a deep dive yourself by clicking on the website and poking around and sharing the results with as many people as you can, as many colleagues and peers as possible. And although this research was specific to the USA, I personally find it extremely useful, and I think this problem is occurring pretty commonly in other areas around the world. So check amongst yourselves if you're not in the USA or North America. See if this feels like this resonates with you for some of the issues and shortages and kind of problems with being under-resourced as volunteer services, if that resonates with you. And sharing is caring, so please spread this information far and wide and advocate for yourself and your programs. That's it for this week's Tuesday Tips. I know it's a lot. We'll see you next time with more fun information. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and let your friends know that this channel exists as a fantastic free resource. We'll see you next time.